Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Constantine. Now, Constantine is a 2005 horror fantasy action film, which is very loosely based on the Hellblazer comics from DC and Vertigo. Now, the movie is directed by Francis Lawrence, who would go on to direct the 2007 adaptation of I Am Legend, another adaptation that really doesn't follow the source material. He also directed Water for Elephants, and I think he directed most of the Hunger Games movies, and I think his most recent film was Red Sparrow. Now, I know he directed a lot of music videos before this, and honestly, you can kind of tell watching this movie that this guy came from music videos. Now, the character of John Constantine was originally created by Alan Moore and Stephen Bissette, and he first appeared as a reoccurring character in Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. But then the character got his own spin-off series, Hellblazer, and over the years, Constantine has become one of DC's most popular characters, and he has shown up in other DC and Vertigo comics, like he showed up in Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and he also showed up in Neil Gaiman's graphic novel, The Books of Magic. The character has also had crossovers with well-known DC characters like Superman and Batman, and in the comics, the character eventually became the leader of the group Justice League Dark, which is basically like the supernatural version of the Justice League. Now, full disclosure, I've only read a little bit of the Hellblazer comics. I have read the first 3 volumes of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, and I actually just did reviews on those 3 books. And I've read many of the other comic books and graphic novels that this character has appeared in, but I've only read a little bit of the Hellblazer comics proper. But that being said, I still know that this movie completely changes everything from the comic books, particularly with the character himself. The character of John Constantine in this movie could not be more different than his counterpart from the books. Now, from what I understand, the movie does loosely adapt the Hellblazer story arc Dangerous Habits, but regardless, this is still considered to be kind of a weak adaptation. But while it might be a bad adaptation of the comics, on its own, I think this is a very good action horror film. And who knows, maybe the reason I'm not as hard on this movie as other people are is because I saw the film before I knew anything about the comics, but you know what? It was this movie that got me interested in looking into the comic book version of this character. And the movie itself actually reminded me a lot of the 1995 film The Prophecy with Christopher Walken, which dealt with a lot of similar themes and ideas. And actually, I almost feel that had they rewrote this script a little bit, this almost could have been a sequel to The Prophecy. Actually, this probably would have made a better Prophecy sequel than the actual Prophecy sequels. Now, the plot of Constantine is it's about a man named John Constantine who is born with the ability to see demons and ghosts, and it turns out that angels and demons live among us, and he was able to tell who is an angel and who is a demon. And this really fucked with him as a child to a point where he thought he was crazy growing up, and his parents thought he was like schizophrenic, and when he was a teenager he actually committed suicide. And because suicide is a sin against God, his soul was condemned to hell, but the doctors managed to resuscitate him, and this actually brought him back. But even though he came back, because he originally took his life, he's now damned. So, over the years, he has become a demon hunter, and it turns out there's an agreement between heaven and hell, and whenever a demon steps over the line, it's his job to send that demon back to hell. But he's not doing this out of, like, the goodness of his heart or anything. He's actually doing this as sort of a way to bribe God to let him into heaven when he dies. But as his guardian angel Gabriel, who is a conniving bitch in this movie, keeps telling him, that's not gonna work. And by doing what he's been doing, he's essentially become #1 on Satan's shit list. And in the film, Constantine gets diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, so he's going to die, and he knows that when he dies, he's going straight to hell. Meanwhile, the movie also follows this police detective named Angie Dobson, whose sister committed suicide, and she thinks that there might be some kind of occult link to her sister's death. So she goes to Constantine for help, and then she's confronted with evidence of the existence of angels and demons. And eventually they learn that somebody is tipping the scales, somebody is interfering with the balance between heaven and hell, and there's a plot to bring about the birth of the Antichrist, which will initiate Armageddon, so now Constantine has to stop this. Now, in the movie, Keanu Reeves plays Constantine, who I actually think does a good job in this movie. Yes, if you compare him to the character from the comics, he's nothing like the comic book iteration of this character at all. Now, just looking at the movie as its own thing, and not so much as an adaptation of the comics, I think the character in this movie is really good, and once again, I think Reeves does a good job. Although I will point out, in the comic books, Constantine is British and has blonde hair, and I think most of those comics actually take place in the UK. Whereas in this movie, Constantine is quite clearly American, and the movie takes place in Los Angeles. I do want to point out that Constantine in the comics was specifically drawn to look like Sting from The Police. Actually, had they done a Constantine movie in the 80s, which is when those comics were first published, Sting would have made the perfect Constantine. In the movie, Rachel Weisz plays Angie, who I actually think is a really good character, and in the movie she almost acts like the audience's surrogate, because she's very much an outsider to this world of the supernatural that Constantine is a part of. But I think Rachel Weisz plays this character really well. You really do buy her as somebody who doesn't believe in the supernatural but is forced to now accept it. But there is an interesting revelation about her character that I'm not going to give away. In the movie, Weisz also plays Angie's twin sister, Isabel. In the movie, Shia LaBeouf plays Chaz Kramer, who is a character in the comics. However, in the comics, he's called Chaz Chandler. And honestly, and this was before Shia LaBeouf became infamous for his performances in the Transformers movies, but here I actually think he did a really good job. Like, you really do buy him as this kid who looks up to John and wants to prove himself to John. In the movie, Djimon Hounsou, I hope I'm saying his name right, plays Papa Midnight, who is a character from the comics, and he does a really good job in this movie as somebody who is sort of playing both sides of the fence. Like in the movie, he sort of refuses to take either side in this war between heaven and hell. Gavin Rossdale, who most people would know as the lead singer of Bush, he plays a demon named Balthazar. Now, I think most of the acting in this movie is pretty good across the board, but there are two standout performances in this film, in my opinion. The first performance I want to talk about is Tilda Swinton as the angel Gabriel, who, as I said in my plot description of this movie, is such a conniving bitch. And she's freaking evil in this movie, despite being, in theory, on God's side. And then you have Peter Stormare as Satan. Now, he only shows up in one scene at the end of this movie, but in his one scene, he steals this freaking movie. Now, Satan in this movie seems to be more so based on a character from the comics called the First of the Fallen, who is sort of the stand-in for Satan in the Hellblazer comics, and based on that name, you would think he's Lucifer himself. However, the Hellblazer comics are in the same universe as Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and you meet Lucifer in that series, and in those comics you find out that Lucifer is not so much the embodiment of all evil, rather he's very much a lost soul. And he actually ends up abandoning hell at a certain point in the Sandman series. However, Lucifer in this movie seems to be much more of the traditional Satan. Like, you see this guy and you really do get the sense that he is the ultimate manifestation of evil in the universe. And even though it's only one scene, I would honestly hold Peter Stormare's performance as the fallen angel Lucifer as one of the best Satan performances in film. Like, I would hold it right up there with Al Pacino's performance in The Devil's Advocate, or Robert De Niro's performance in Angel Heart, or Telly Savalas' performance in Lisa and the Devil, or Viggo Mortensen's performance in The Prophecy. Like, to me, Peter Stormare in this movie, he really is one of the top movie devils. And one thing I really do appreciate about this movie is there's a lot about the mythology that really isn't explained, because Constantine has been a part of this world for so long that all of this has become really mundane to him. And he's not the kind of person to sit there and explain all this to somebody who's a novice to this world of the supernatural. But I will say, I think there's enough exposition in this movie where we as the audience can understand what's going on in the story. Like, in the movie you have the whole concept of the half-breeds. Like, in the film it explains that angels and demons, in order to exist in our world, have to become half-breeds, but it doesn't really explain how half-breeding works. Like, you're not sure if angels and demons have to take possession of human bodies in order to become half-breeds, or are they, like, physically born into our world. So, the movie really does feel like you're being thrusted into this world, especially with the relationship between Constantine and some of the other characters, where it's clear that he has a history with a lot of these people. Like, it's clear in the movie that Constantine and Papa Midnight have a long history with each other. It's also clear in the movie that the demon Balthazar is an old enemy of Constantine's, so there's a lot of hints in this film of all these other stories that could be told. And again, even though this isn't a faithful adaptation of the comics, I do think there was a lot of thought that went into this movie. I also think the movie is very well made and very well shot. Now, as I point out already, you could tell that Francis Lawrence came from music videos seeing this movie, because there's a lot about this movie that does almost have a music video kind of feel, but I'm not saying that as a negative. I think for this movie and the style of movie that this is, it works. Now, there are a lot of CGI effects in this movie, but I actually think most of the CGI in this film holds up pretty well. Like, it's actually well done CGI. However, there is one effect shot in this movie that is actually pretty laughably bad, but I'm willing to forgive things like that. But yeah, I actually really do like Constantine, and I actually think this movie is a lot better than its reputation would lead you to believe. Yes, it's not really true to the comics, but that doesn't automatically equate bad. So I recommend 2005's Constantine, but again, that's just my opinion. Now, if you are looking for a more faithful adaptation of the comics, I'll admit I haven't seen it yet, but from what I understand, the NBC series Constantine is a lot closer to the source material. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Chris did on this movie.
So the thing I like about Constantine, as opposed to what I feel a lot of people hate about it, is the Americanization of an intrinsically British character. And the funny thing about that is I feel like it works very well, while a lot of people were probably like, nah, it's the movie's biggest failing, because a big appeal of Constantine was that he was this sort of this, for lack of a better term, cunty British dude. Whereas the American version of him played surprisingly well by Keanu. He works really well. They did a good job, I think, of capturing the spirit of Hellblazer, but kind of changing up Constantine and making him into a different character, one who's a little bit more haunted. While, you know, British Constantine is haunted, but this one is on a whole other level with him being able to see demons and all that stuff. I really love the way they did Gabriel. Tilda kind of killed it. She was kind of known for playing androgynous characters for a while, so it makes sense that they got her. And I like that it's a whole bunch of arcs kind of bled into one. Like, there's, bad habits, and then, dangerous habits, my bad. And then the whole demon baby arc, kind of bled into one story, and it doesn't feel hobbled together. It actually blends together pretty well. I like Constantine's weaponry in this, with like the heavy emphasis on Christianity and all that stuff. It's very different from the straight up magician Constantine of the books. And on top of that, the emphasis on Christianity in this is kind of different from how it was for Hellblazer, because it's very almost focused on that aspect of the supernatural, whereas Hellblazer is a little bit more straightforward. And it makes, I think, for a movie that has a different effect than the books, because in the same way that Exorcist is about religion, this focuses on that in a way of, well, if you believe in God, you got to believe in the devil. And that's a very scary thing when you think about it, and you're kind of confronted with it head on. That's what made Exorcist so scary back in the day, and that's what works well for Constantine too. It's a lot more brutal, I think, than the books, and it's a lot more visceral, and it's very haunting. It has kind of like this sort of dreary look, but also jokey, which I like a lot. That's something that I'm seeing in a lot of movies that I appreciate. And I guess the last thing is I like the ending a lot, with the whole reveal that, okay, he had cancer, but now, like, the devil so badly wants to fuck him over, he legit rips the cancer out of him so that he has a second chance to fuck himself up. And then that great final shot where he, puts in the nicotine gum. He's going to quit and try to, like, redeem himself. It's a weird spot of hope in a movie that seemed nihilistic despite all the Christianity. So what you get is a product that is very much a huge reinterpretation of what Constantine is, but works very well, I think, and never really got enough credit. They did what they wanted to do with it, basically. And they did a good job, honestly. It got hate because it wasn't that Constantine. But I feel like the people who were kind of true fans of it did appreciate the movie, because I remember there was a novelization. Well, no, it wasn't a novelization. It was just a straight up like Hellblazer story done as a novel. And British Constantine mentions that he knows about the alternate American version of Constantine who lives in another universe. So I feel like that shout out to him was kind of acknowledgement that, actually that really wasn't that bad a story. And even like British Constantine would like that version of Constantine himself. Really funny and very self-aware. I like that. So if you haven't seen this and you consider yourself a Hellblazer fan, or if you don't know anything about Hellblazer and want kind of like a palate cleanser for it, this works really well. I highly recommend it.
So I hope you enjoyed my friend's take on this movie, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall, but that was my review on Constantine, and bye.